The Kansas wind in the autumn of 1873 didn't blow so much as it clawed at the sod walls of the Pruitt homestead, at the gaps beneath the door, at the thin wool dress Mabel Pruitt wore every single day because it was the only dress she had left. She was 23 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Olive and a 5-year-old son named Charlie. And she had exactly $4.60 hidden inside a cracked teacup on the highest shelf, and a mortgage note due in 11 days to a man named Aldous Greer, who smiled when he talked about taking things from people. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 4 months. A threshing accident in July, the kind that happens fast and ends everything slow. He had been a good man, careful with money, careful with his hands, meticulous about the property line stakes he'd driven into the black Kansas soil himself. He had believed, with the quiet, unremarkable faith of a farmer, that this land would outlast him. He just hadn't expected to be proven right so soon. On the morning of November 3rd, the frost on the window panes was thick as river ice. Mabel had already rationed the cornmeal twice that week. The smokehouse held half a salted ham and her pride in equal and dwindling portions. Olive was coughing again. That dry, persistent cough that had Mabel pressing her ear to the child's back at night, listening for the sound she was most afraid to hear. She pulled on Thomas's barn coat, rolled the sleeves 3 times, and picked up the water pail. "Stay inside," she told the children. "Both of you, under the quilt until I'm back." Olive looked up with large, serious eyes. "How long?" "Not long," Mabel said. She didn't know if that was true. The creek was a quarter-mile east through the cornfield stubble, and the cold hit her like a judgment the moment she stepped out. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and featureless. The ground was iron-hard beneath her boots. She walked fast, arms crossed against her chest, the empty pail banging against her knee. She almost missed him entirely. It was the horse that stopped her. A big roan gelding standing motionless in the dead cornstalks about 40 yards from the water's edge, reins dragging in the frozen dirt. The animal's ears were flat, its head hanging low. Mabel stopped. Horses didn't stand alone in November fields without a reason. She found the reason 15 feet behind the horse. A man was lying face up on the ground, one arm flung wide, the other pressed hard against his side. His coat was dark, and at first she thought it was the color of the wool. Then she understood it wasn't. She stood very still for a moment. The frontier had taught her things that Missouri girlhood never had. It had taught her that a man on the ground could be drunk or dead or dangerous, and only one of those was truly her problem. She gripped the pail handle and took a step closer. He was breathing. She could see it. The shallow, labored rise of his chest. The faint cloud of vapor at his lips. His face was turned slightly to the side, a hard face, deeply weathered, maybe 40 years old, with a jaw like a fence rail and a 3-day beard, dark with grit and dried blood. Someone had put a knife in him. She could see the handle of it. No, the hilt was gone, the blade gone. Someone had pulled the weapon out and left the wound to do the rest of the work. "Lord Almighty," Mabel said under her breath. She knelt beside him. His coat was good quality, thick canvas with a sheepskin lining, the kind a man bought to last, and beneath it his shirt was soaked through. The wound was in his right side, below the ribs, still seeping. His eyes opened. They were brown, shot through with amber, and they looked at her with the flat animal focus of a man who has reduced his entire world to the question of whether the next person he sees is going to finish the job. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mabel said, very clearly and calmly, in the voice she used when Charlie woke screaming from nightmares. "I live here. You're on my land. You've been stabbed, and you're going to bleed to death in my cornfield if you don't let me help you." He stared at her. "Can you stand?" His jaw moved. He said something too quiet to hear. She leaned closer. The ledger," he rasped. "Don't let Greer." The name hit her like cold water. Aldous Greer. The man's eyes closed. His head dropped back against the frozen soil. Mabel sat back on her heels and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She looked at the sky. She looked at the roan horse, which looked back at her with an expression of resigned patience. "You have terrible timing," she said, to no one in particular. Then she got up and grabbed his arm. She was 5 feet 4 inches and weighed 115 pounds. He was built like a barn door. Getting him upright took 3 attempts and language she would not have used with the children present. The Rowan, to his credit, stood steady while she maneuvered the barely conscious man against the saddle. She couldn't get him up and over. That was beyond her. But she could loop his arm over the horn and lead the horse, and she did, all the way back across the field and up the slight rise to the sod house, where Olive was already standing in the doorway with wide eyes. "Olive, get inside. Get my sewing basket and the whiskey from under the floorboard. Now, please. Mama, who is now, sweetheart?" Getting him through the door was an ordeal she would not fully remember afterward. She would remember the weight of him, and the sound he made when his side caught the door frame, and Charlie pressing himself flat against the wall with both hands over his mouth. She remembered getting him down onto the rag rug in front of the iron stove, and she remembered that his coat smelled like wood smoke and horse, and something sharper underneath, like cold metal. She cut away his shirt with the kitchen shears. The wound was bad, but not hopeless. The blade had gone in at an angle, she could see that, from the shape of the gash, and it had missed whatever it had been aimed for. The bleeding was the problem. It was slow and steady, the kind that killed you in hours if you were lucky enough to be left alone. Mabel had brought 4 children into the world before the 2 who lived, with no doctor within 40 miles each time. She had set a broken finger, lanced an infected bite, and once stitched a 3-inch cut on Thomas's forearm by lamplight while he cursed steadily into a folded piece of leather. She was not squeamish. She was practical, and practicality was all that stood between her family and the ground. She boiled the whiskey bottle in the kettle, or rather, she boiled water and scalded her needle and the shears in her hands. The whiskey she poured directly into the wound. He came off the floor, not all the way, he didn't have the strength, but his whole body convulsed upward, and a sound came out of him that made both children clap their hands over their ears. Charlie started crying. Olive grabbed his arm with the serious, firm grip of someone much older. "Hold him," Mabel said, and she meant it. She worked fast. She had used fishing line to close wounds before, and she used it now, 7 stitches tight and even, the way her mother had taught her to close a seam. She packed the wound with strips of clean linen, torn from the hem of her second-best pillowcase. She bound his midsection with long strips of the same cloth and tied it firm. By the time she sat back, her hands were trembling and the fire had burned low. The man was unconscious. His breathing had steadied into something less alarming, still shallow, but rhythmic now, no longer the desperate gasp of someone actively dying. "Is he dead?" Charlie whispered from behind Olive. "No," Mabel said. "Go to bed, both of you. Don't touch anything on that floor." She sat in the rocking chair beside the stove and watched him breathe for a long time. Aldous Greer. The man had said Greer's name before he lost consciousness. Not her mortgage holder, not the county commissioner who had shown up on her porch twice in the past month with a smile and a folded document. The same Greer who had sent a rider out to inform her that Thomas's land note had been reassigned, and the new terms were her signature or her eviction. She looked at the man on her floor. She looked at the saddlebag she had pulled from the roan's back and set by the door. She told herself she would wait until morning. She didn't wait until morning. The saddlebag held a change of clothes, a box of cartridges, a wrapped piece of hard cheese, and a flat oilskin packet tied with waxed cord. She undid the cord with careful fingers and spread the contents on the table. Survey documents, detailed ones, drawn in a precise hand she didn't recognize, with notations along the margins in pencil. There were deeds, not hers, but her neighbor Harlan's to the south, and the widow Pfeiffer's to the north, and 4 other parcels she recognized from the shape of the section lines. And, beneath all of it, a letter on official government stationery from the General Land Office in Topeka, addressed to one Deputy Marshal Caleb Rourke, directing him to investigate allegations of fraudulent land transfers in Barton County, Kansas, and to collect relevant documentation for federal review. Mabel read the letter twice. Then she looked at the man on her floor with entirely different eyes. A federal marshal. Aldous Greer had put a federal marshal in her cornfield. The fever came that night, as she had known it would. Mabel moved the children to the loft and sat vigil with a basin of cold creek water and a cloth, doing what she could. Rourke, she had the name now, moved in and out of consciousness, his big hands clenching and releasing against the rug. He talked in the fever's grip. He said words she couldn't catch and names she didn't know, and once, clearly enough to understand, he said, "Evidence. It's all in the secondary parcel. He falsified the survey date. She leaned closer. What secondary parcel? But he had gone back under and didn't surface again until just before dawn. The fire had burned low again. Mabel was nearly asleep in the rocker, her chin dipping toward her chest when the quality of the silence in the room changed. She opened her eyes. Caleb Rourke was looking at her. The fever was still in him. She could see it in the glassy sheen of his eyes, the high color in his face. But his gaze was focused, aware. His hand moved toward his hip. The holster was empty. She had put the gun in the flour tin on the highest shelf. Your gun is safe, she said. So are your papers. You're in the Pruitt homestead, 2 miles south of the Cimarron Crossing Road. I found you in my east field yesterday morning. You'd been stabbed. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the stove. He looked at her hands, which were still faintly stained despite the washing, and at the basin and the cloth. You stitched me, he said. It wasn't a question. Fishing line. I apologize for that. He was quiet for a moment. How long? 1 day. Your horse is in the barn. Your papers are in the oilskin. You read them. I did, she said. I needed to know if you were a criminal or a lawman. The distinction seemed important, given that someone just tried to kill you. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, too controlled for that, and then it was gone. Mrs. Pruitt, yes. Aldous Greer cannot know I'm alive, or that I'm here. I gathered that, she said. Drink this water, Mr. Rourke. You're going to die of thirst before the knife wound has a chance to finish you, and I've put too much work in to watch that happen. He drank. Slowly, watching her over the rim of the tin cup with those amber dark eyes. Then he lay back and closed them, and he said nothing else for a very long time. But before he slept, one corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, just enough. For 3 days, the weather closed in, and the world outside the Pruitt homestead ceased to exist. Inside, something else began, tentative, quiet, the way spring comes to Kansas, not all at once but in small negotiations with the cold. Rourke was a difficult patient. He was not a man accustomed to stillness or to being tended to, and it showed in the set of his jaw whenever Mabel changed his dressing, and in the way he stared at the ceiling with the barely contained energy of a man who needed to be doing something and couldn't. But he was not ungrateful. He was precise about it, a simple, direct thank you with his eyes meeting hers, no elaboration. And somehow that brevity made it weigh more than a speech would have. On the second afternoon, Charlie edged closer to the rocking chair that Rourke had claimed as his convalescent throne. Are you a real marshal? Charlie asked. Rourke looked at him steadily. I am. Do you have a badge? It's in my coat. Left breast pocket. Charlie looked at his mother. Mabel nodded slightly. Charlie retrieved the badge, a 5-pointed star, dented on one tip, and held it like it might do something unexpected. What happened to this part? A man in Dodge City had a different opinion about whether I should arrest him, Rourke said. His opinion was wrong, but his aim was close. Charlie grinned. It was the first time he'd grinned in weeks. Olive was subtler about her warming to him. She watched from across the room with her mother's eyes, measuring, patient, unconvinced by surface things. But on the evening of the second day, she set a bowl of cornmeal mush by his chair without being asked. Rourke looked at the bowl. He looked at the girl. Much obliged, he said. Olive went back to her corner without a word. But she didn't leave the room. That night, after the children were asleep in the loft, Mabel sat at the table with the survey documents spread between them, and Rourke talked. He was still pale, still moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body was making its objections known, but his mind was sharp. Aldous Greer had been operating a scheme of extraordinary patience and ordinary greed. Over 7 years, he had been purchasing or pressuring the acquisition of homesteads along a 12-mile stretch of river-bottom land in Barton County. The precise corridor, Rourke explained, where the proposed spur line of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad needed to lay track. The railroad would pay handsomely for right-of-way through that corridor. Greer had been positioning himself to own every inch of it. The fraudulent element, the part that made it federal, was the survey manipulation. Greer had a man in the county land office, a clerk named Pettifer, who had been quietly backdating and altering survey plats to show property lines shifted in Greer's favor. Parcels that had been legally settled by homesteaders showed on the fraudulent documents as untitled government land, land that Greer had then legally purchased at minimal cost. Your husband's parcel, Rourke said carefully, sits at the midpoint of the corridor. The plat Greer filed in August shows your eastern boundary shifted 300 yards west. On paper, that makes your creek access government land, which means the railroad right-of-way through the creek bed would belong to Greer, not you. Mabel looked at the survey lines. She had stood on that eastern boundary 100 times. She knew exactly where it was. Thomas drove those stakes himself, she said. I know. I've seen the original survey, filed in 1869 with the General Land Office. Greer's version is a forgery. Rourke tapped the oilskin packet. The original is in here, along with Pettifer's own correspondence. He kept copies, insurance, I suspect. A man who'll betray one employer will consider betraying the next. He paused. Greer knew I was getting close to filing. He had Pettifer tip him off. The men who came for me, 2 of them outside of Laurent, were Greer's. And Pettifer? Rourke's expression didn't change exactly. It just settled into something harder. Pettifer had an accident 2 weeks ago. He's in a Topeka hospital. That's why I was riding alone. I was trying to get the documents to the federal courthouse in Wichita before Greer could suppress them. The fire snapped and settled. Outside, the wind pushed at the sod walls. He came here last month, Mabel said. Greer, with the reassigned mortgage note, and $100 in cash, and a very pleasant manner. She folded her hands on the table. He told me Thomas would have wanted me to take care of the children, and that staying alone on a Kansas homestead was no life for a woman. He made it sound like he was doing me a kindness. Rourke watched her face. I told him to get off my property, she said. He said the note was due in 11 days. How many days now? She counted. 7. They looked at each other across the table, across the survey maps and the oilskin documents, and the last lamp burning low. I'll be on my feet in 2 more days, Rourke said. That still leaves 5. That's enough, he said. I just need to get a telegraph to Wichita. On the 5th morning, the sky cleared. The frost burned off by midday, and the field steamed gently in the weak November sun, the kind of day that offered the illusion of mercy. Mabel was washing dishes at the basin when she heard it. The particular silence that follows the cessation of chopping wood, a silence with a different texture than ordinary quiet. She looked out the window. Rourke was standing in the yard with an axe in one hand, perfectly still, facing south. He had insisted on being useful from the 4th morning onward, and she had given up arguing with him after he pointed out that the woodpile was genuinely low and that standing still hurt more than moving. He had worked steadily and with a methodical efficiency that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Thomas. Not in temperament, but in the particular way a capable man at work makes his body look like part of the landscape. Now he was not working. He set the axe down against the block without a word and reached for the jacket hung on the fence post. Mabel was in the doorway before he turned around. How many? She asked. 3 riders, coming up the south track. He looked at her steadily. You still have the Sharps? Thomas's, behind the flour barrel. Get it. He paused. Mabel, get the children in the root cellar. It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it, stored it away, and went to get the rifle. Olive and Charlie went into the root cellar without argument. Olive's face was white but set, and she took Charlie's hand with a firmness that made Mabel's throat close briefly. Mabel dropped the heavy board door and smoothed the braided rug over it and turned around. Rourke was standing at the edge of the porch, his coat open, his right hand loose at his side. He had reclaimed his revolver from the flour tin at some point without comment, and it rested in the holster with the quiet authority of a thing that had been where it belonged. The 3 riders came out of the bare cottonwoods at the south end of the field. Aldous Greer was in the center. He was a man of 60. Immaculately turned out even on horseback, beaver hat, broadcloth coat, the kind of grooming that communicated power in a county where most men's hands were permanently dirty. He rode with his back very straight. On his left was a large man Mabel recognized, Walt Seger, who ran Greer's cattle operation and had eyes like 2 stones in shallow water. On his right was a younger man she had never seen, lean and watchful in the saddle. Greer's eyes found Rourke, and for just a moment, just one, the pleasant executive face went somewhere else entirely. Marshal Rourke, Greer said, recovering smoothly, I'm relieved to see you alive. There have been distressing reports of violence on the roads near Larned. I was just coming to check on Mrs. Pruitt and her children. At this hour, Mabel said, on a November morning with 2 armed men. She did not phrase it as a question. A man in my position makes enemies, Mrs. Pruitt. I like to travel with company. Greer's attention drifted back to Rourke, easy and deliberate, the way a cat watches a bird without appearing to watch it. You look unwell, Marshal. Perhaps you should have stayed in bed. I had business to attend to, Rourke said. The telegraph office in town sent a reply this morning. There are 2 deputies riding up from Wichita. They'll be here by nightfall. Something shifted in Greer's posture. The pleasant expression held, but whatever was behind it made a small, involuntary adjustment. The documents you were carrying, Greer said carefully, are in Wichita, Rourke said. Copies went east 2 days ago by courier. Pettifer, when he wakes up, will have a great deal to say. He already wrote most of it down. Walt Sager's hand moved toward his hip. Walt, Greer said sharply. Sager stopped. Mabel had come to stand beside Rourke on the porch, the sharps at her side, her finger outside the guard but present. The young man on Greer's right glanced at her and then away with the specific look of someone recalculating the mathematics of a situation. Greer sat very straight on his horse. He was still smiling. It was the smile of a man who had been surprised, but was determining in real time what options remained. You can't prove the surveys were altered, he said. Pettifer was a county employee. Any irregularities would be administrative errors. The original 1869 survey has your handwriting in the margin, Rourke said. You marked the section lines yourself. The property of a man who knew exactly where they were supposed to be before he had them moved. He paused. Step down off that horse, Mr. Greer. Greer looked at him for a long moment. You poisoned the county, Mabel said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which somehow made it carry further. You took land from families who earned it and filed on it and broke their backs over it. You took it with paperwork and politeness, and you never once had to look anyone in the eye while you did it. Thomas wouldn't sell to you. Did you know he'd received an approach from the railroad directly? The stillness that followed was absolute. Greer's face changed. He came home in September, Mabel said. 2 weeks before the threshing, a man from the Santa Fe line had ridden out and offered him a right-of-way contract. Thomas was going to sign it. He told me that evening. She watched Greer's eyes. He never had the chance. Greer said nothing. The threshing, Mabel said. The belt came loose. Thomas went to fix it, and the machine started, and She stopped. She made herself breathe. Tell me that was an accident, Mr. Greer. Tell me that was God's plain timing and not yours. Greer looked away, to the south, to the bare cottonwoods. He didn't say it was an accident. Mabel raised the Sharp's rifle. Her hands, after 4 months of grief and 1 week of fighting to keep her children alive, were perfectly steady. She had Thomas's own gun in her hands and the man who had likely killed him in her sights, and the distance between those 2 facts was very small. Mabel. Rourke said it quietly, not a command, not a plea, just her name. She didn't lower the gun, not immediately. She stood there in the November light and looked at Aldous Greer over the barrel, and she thought about Thomas, about the way he had driven those survey stakes into his own earth with his own hands and believed that meant something. About Olive's face when he didn't come home. About Charlie reaching for his father's hand in the night for 3 weeks after the funeral. In the dark, not knowing he was doing it. Don't, Rourke said softly. He'll answer for it. A courtroom, a jury, a judge, that's what answers for it, not you. He paused. Your children need you standing, not carrying this. She breathed. She lowered the rifle. Get off my property, she said to Greer. Her voice was very calm. The deputies will find you in town. Greer looked at her for a moment. The pleasant manner was entirely gone. What remained was older and colder and, without the mask, considerably less impressive. He turned his horse. Walt Sager followed. The young man on the right glanced once more at the porch, at Rourke's hand, at the Sharps and Mabel's, and then followed without any expression at all. They rode south into the cottonwoods and were gone. The federal deputies arrived at dusk, 4 of them riding hard from Wichita. Aldous Greer was in the Barton County Jail by nightfall, along with Walt Sager and the land office clerk who had worked as Greer's intermediary, a man named Dull who had, upon learning that Pettifer's depositions were already in federal hands, decided that cooperation was considerably more comfortable than the alternative. The charges were extensive. land fraud, falsification of federal survey documents, conspiracy to defraud homesteaders of their legal property, and, once the investigation reached into the September records at the county coroner's office, one count that did not include the word fraud at all. The mortgage note on the Pruitt homestead was voided before Christmas. The land returned to clear title with an official letter from the General Land Office that Mabel would keep in the teacup for the rest of her life, alongside the $4.60 she never had to spend. The Santa Fe representative came in February, when the ground was hard again and the sky was the specific blue of a Kansas winter that offers cold comfort and extraordinary beauty. He offered a right-of-way contract for the Eastern Creek access. The terms were fair. The amount would have made Thomas laugh with surprise and possibly cry. Mabel signed it. She was standing at the kitchen table folding laundry on a gray March morning when she heard a horse in the yard and looked out the window. Rourke had his saddlebags over one shoulder. He was wearing his marshal's coat, the dented badge glinting at his chest, and his hat was pulled low against the spring wind. He had been sleeping in the barn for 3 months with a stubbornness she'd eventually stopped arguing about, riding into town when needed, riding back in the evenings. She went to the door before he could knock. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her the way he'd been carefully not looking at her for 3 months, directly without the habitual guard. "The circuit court in Wichita starts in April," he said. "I'll need to testify. After that, the marshal's office has a posting in Dodge that—" He stopped. "There's always another posting." "There is," Mabel said. "You have clear title now, the contract with the railroad, the children are settled." He turned the hat brim in his hands once. "You don't need—" "No," Mabel agreed. "I don't." He looked at her. "But April is a long way off," she said. "And the fence line on the north quarter needs replacing before the ground thaws. And Charlie has been asking someone to teach him to track since November, and I have been making supper for 4 people every single evening without being asked." Rourke was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard, carrying the first faint green smell of a season turning. "I don't know how to stay in one place," he said. It was honest. It was careful. It was the thing a man said when he wanted to be told it was all right anyway. "I know," Mabel said. "Thomas didn't either, when I first knew him. He figured it out." She stepped back and held the door open. Caleb Rourke looked at the open doorway, at the warm interior of the sod house, at the battered rocking chair by the stove that had somehow become his in the 3 months since November. He looked at Olive peering at him from behind the flour barrel with her careful, measuring eyes. He looked at Charlie, who was grinning already, who had been grinning since he heard the horse. He put his hat back on his head. He picked up his saddlebags. He walked inside. The door closed behind him, and the Kansas wind went on without them, carrying winter off toward the horizon, leaving the ground ready for whatever a person chose to plant in it.